Hello investigators and welcome to Until the End of Time. My name is Veronica and today I'm going to do the Darrell Simmons deep dive video by popular request. This video is going to go into as much nuance of playing Darrell Simmons as I can manage, but keep in mind that the box is only just released and I haven't had a chance to play with everything yet. Still, I hope this video will give you some ideas to experiment with and make your first time playing Darrell go a little smoother. Also, as should be obvious, but just in case, this video will contain cards from the Scarlet Keys box, so if you're still trying to avoid spoilers or whatever, this is your warning, tune out now. Let's start off with the man himself. Darrell Simmons is the photographer. He has 2 willpower, a whopping 5 intellect, 2 combat, and mediocre 3 agility. Let's go back and remember the time when Wendy having 3 intellect was considered to be high for a survivor. And yet, here we are with a 5 intellect survivor. And that's not all. Darrell begins play with his Kodak in play, we'll look at that in a bit, and then he has a free triggered ability he can use during a skill test at his location to spend 1 evidence from an asset he controls to reduce the difficulty of that test by 2, limit once per test. This is undeniably a very powerful ability. Difficulty reduction is very strong, and being able to help anyone at your location with their tests is quite nice. You're going to need to have a bit of evidence, but we'll see about how we can get that. Finally, his Elder Sign, +1, place an evidence on an asset you control. He's got 6 health and 8 sanity, and he cares about evidence. Well, let's look at his deck building. He's got Survivor cards 0 to 5, Seeker cards 0 to 2, Nuclear cards 0 to 5. His deck building requirements are Darrell's Kodak, Ruined Film, and 1 random basic weakness, and he's got a deck size of 30. I assume most of you will have known this, but for the sake of being complete, I figured I'd mention it at the top of the video. So Darrell's Kodak is a 2-cost asset with intellect, agility, and wild icons. It is item and tool traded. It is Darrell Simmons deck only, and it has a reaction after an enemy or treachery enters play. Exhaust the Kodak to place a resource from the token pool on that enemy or treachery as evidence, and after you discover any number of clues, move that many evidence on enemies or treacheries at that location or not at any location to Darrell's Kodak. So the way that this works is most of the time, let's say an enemy spawns at your location, you put an evidence on it, and then when you get a clue from that location, you can also get that evidence. Note that you have to get clues in order to get the evidence, not to overcome the encounter card. So in the case of the enemy, if you kill the enemy, the evidence is going to go away. So you have to get the clue first, then get the evidence. It's more reliable with higher player counts, although in my experience, I think at 2-player, you're probably still going to be fine. You might want to include a couple of cards to help you mess with the encounter deck a bit, so you can more reliably trigger this ability. But as a general rule, you're going to have something that enters play most turns, if not every turn. It starts in play, it's slotless, so it's rarely going to leave play unless you draw like an encounter card that makes you discard it. And if you do that, you're going to have to get it back and pay the 2. But in general, this card should stick in play most of the time. Ruined Film is a treachery, weakness, blunder traded. It has the revelation effect. Remove 4 evidence from cards you control. For each evidence you cannot remove in this way, take 1 horror. You can pick which cards this removes the evidence from. So if you have a couple of cards that have evidence that you can actually use, and something like the Kodak, which is only used for Darrell's ability, you probably want to remove it from the Kodak first. But you don't have a choice in taking the horror if you'd rather take the horror, which I think a lot of Darrell decks could potentially prefer. But you have to remove evidence if you have it. Keep in mind that if you don't have any evidence on cards, this could deal 4 horror out of nowhere, which can be a big hit. So be a little careful. If you haven't seen your weakness yet and you don't have any evidence because you're spending it to fuel Darrell's ability or maybe other abilities, that you do have some way of soaking that hit. Survivor has a lot of options here, but yeah. One thing to note is that it doesn't have any kind of action ability or action tax. It just removes your evidence and maybe deals you some horror, which is worth saying. A lot of enemy weaknesses and like treacheries that get in your threat area and then you have to spend actions to clear it can slow down an investigator. Darrell doesn't have to slow down to deal with his weakness unless he needs to soak or build up evidence again. So yeah, those are the signature cards and the investigator card, but what do we do with him? Now, when I made the video for Kamani Jones, I did a grid with 4 different deck ideas because I considered Kamani to be pretty flexible and possibly to build in a lot of different directions. For Darrell, I went with a slightly different approach, as you'll hopefully see the hexagonal sequence. because I figured that Darrell is less likely to be a very different deck and more trying to do a similar thing with slightly different tools and utilities. Because to me, Darrell's always going to be primarily a clue getter with maybe some flex power built in if you want to go that direction. And the real question isn't, are you getting clues or not? Because you are. The question is, how are you getting your clues and what are you doing to get the most out of his ability? Starting off, just evidence in general. Before the Scarlet Keys came out, there were only, I believe, 2 cards that had evidence on them, one of which he can't even use, which is Michael Lee. So we're gonna have to be leaning mostly on the Scarlet Keys cards, though it's worth saying that the Hawkeye folding camera is a very powerful tool for him. It's worth saying that that reaction ability on there isn't limited to 3 times, or limited to 3 evidence on this card. So every time you discover the lost clue from a location, though only once per game at each location, you're going to put an evidence on this thing, and that can build up over 3. So this could be a nice little evidence pool for you if you're clearing locations very quickly. In certain scenarios, there's definitely options to do that. However, Scarlet Keys gives us a bunch of extra cards. I'm going to be talking more about the research notes later, but it's worth saying that the card does use evidence. Empirical Hypothesis is one of the Seeker customizable cards, and at the start of the round, you choose one of the following criteria. You either fail the test by 2 or more, or you succeed a test by 3 or more. When the chosen criteria is met, you may exhaust the Empirical Hypothesis to add an evidence to it, and you can free trigger spend an evidence to draw a card. Now this is a customizable card, so it comes with an upgrade sheet. Because Darrell can only take Seeker up to level 4 or level 2, he can only use 4 checkboxes on that card. But it's still worth saying he can take this card, and it's actually pretty great in him, because it provides you with extra evidence, and if you don't need the evidence, you could just draw a bunch of cards. Finally, the dissection tools are a new 0 XP 2 cost Seeker asset. Has an agility icon, it is item, tool, and science traded, takes up a hand slot, and has a reaction after an enemy at your location is defeated. Place a resource from the token pool on this card as evidence. While the section tools has 1 or more evidence, you get +1 agility, 2 or more evidence, you get +1 combat, and 3 or more evidence, you get +1 sanity. So this is very much like the Hawkeye folding camera, except it's focused around the combat, physical stats, and defeating enemies. I would say that this is generally going to be worse for Darrell than the camera. He doesn't really care as much about these stats, and he's much less likely to be the one defeating enemies, meaning he needs to be checking with his Guardian to make sure he can get the most out of it. But one of the very important things is that this isn't limited in any way as to the amount of evidence this can produce, which I just want to mention because in the Dream Eaters campaign there are a lot of enemies with the swarming keyword, which spawn additional copies of the enemy underneath that enemy, and each one counts as a separate enemy being defeated. So I expect that if you're playing Darrell in the Dream Eaters, you will be using dissection tools to get a crazy amount of evidence, which you can then turn into very powerful effects with his ability. So yeah, here's your 5 tools basically to get your evidence. Kodak, Hawkeye folding camera are probably going to be pretty likely to make the cut, or at least be up there for the most reliable source of evidence collection. But I think all of these cards warrant some consideration, some thought. But you're going to need to balance your ability to get evidence and your ability to spend evidence, especially if you don't want to take 4 horror from your weakness, Ruined Film. If you want to play Cherished Keepsake, a survivor card, that could definitely help. Cherished Keepsake level 1 can even soak all 4 horror in one go, but as a general rule, you're probably going to need to float a little bit of evidence just to make sure that your weakness doesn't just blast you. And because of that, I think it is going to be important to have more tools than just the Kodak to get evidence. And I think these are some of the most likely tools. All of them are level 0, or at least can be taken from 0 XP. So hopefully you can pick one of these up and use it. So yeah, that's evidence. Next up, we're going to focus on one of the new archetypes from the Scarlet Keys expansion, which is difficulty 0 matters. So Survivor has already had a bit of a difficulty manipulation sub-theme in there. They have cards like Winging It, which reduce the shroud of an location by 1 while you're investigating it, and then potentially gives you an extra clue. But now they have this new skill card called Gumption, which I would have preferred if it was called Expected Courage, because it gives you a -2 difficulty, which is very similar to Unexpected Courage, +2 wild icons. But there's basically, yeah, it's a 1 XP skill card that reduces the difficulty of any test by 2. So it's kind of like Darrell's ability, but again, pretty cool card. And of course, there's always the classic flashlight. So why does this matter? Well, As a general rule, difficulty reduction is already better than increasing your stat value. For a simple example, let's say you are testing Grasping Hands, you're Darrell, and you have 3 agility, and you commit unexpected courage because you don't want to take any damage. And you pull an autofail. Well, you're taking 3 damage because you have failed by 3. But if you committed gumption or used this ability, then instead, when you autofail, the difficulty of the test is only 1. So you're only failing by 1 point, and thus you're only taking 1 damage. And in this way, both Darrell's ability and gumption can be used as kind of mild encounter card manipulation. Not full-on, like, cancelling effects, but, in a way, this is protecting you from these nasty fail-by effects. In addition, they're usually very good when you're setting up a certain fail by a certain amount checks. One of the classic examples here is Look What I Found. If you're in a 4-shroud location and you use a card like Old Keyring, you can reduce the shroud to 2. No matter what you pull, you will either succeed the test or be able to play Look What I Found. Now this card is less relevant for Darrell because he has 5 intellect, and so it's pretty likely to succeed the test against difficulty 2. But this is the kind of mechanic that a lot of people use, and there are fight and evade versions of Look What I Found, called Oops and Dumb Luck, which you might want to slot into Darrell. But probably most important are this new suite of tricks that specifically work if the difficulty of a test is 0. We've seen Exploit Weakness during the preview season, and you can play it. It's a fast event that costs 2 resources that you play before revealing a Chaos token during an attack or evasion attempt you are performing, and only if the difficulty of the test is currently 0, making this test automatically succeed, and instead of the test normal effect, discard the attacked or evaded enemy. If it's elite, automatically evade it and deal it 3 damage instead. In the box, we also see Shed a Light. This is also a 2-cost 0 XP event, Intellect and Agility icons, Insight and Trick traded. Fast, play before revealing a Chaos token during the investigation you are performing, and only if the difficulty of the test is currently 0. This test automatically succeeds. You discover 1 additional clue at this location and an additional clue at any location. So if you can get the shroud of a location down to 0, or otherwise reduce the difficulty to 0, you are going to get 3 clues minimum out of that test, and 1 of those clues can come from any location. Fantastic for using the Kodak to pick up evidence from a location you're not at. Then there's also an upgraded card that you really are going to care about, which is the Old Keyring level 3. This 1-cost asset has 2 intellect icons now, and is an item and tool. It uses 3 keys instead of 2, and if there's no keys on the Old Keyring, you discard it. As an action you can investigate, the location gets -2 shroud of this investigation. If you succeed, remove a key from Old Keyring. And if the test difficulty is 0, you discover an additional clue. So here we're seeing an archetype that specifically cares about test difficulty being 0. This is already very strong, but with these cards it just gets stronger, and the more difficulty reducing effect you can stack, the better. Darrell's ability, being able to enhance an Old Keyring test, means that you can use this level 3 Keyring to get 2 clues off of a 4-shroud location. That's fantastic. But what if you want to get even more clues with Keyring 3? Well, maybe we should recur it. So moving on, let's talk about Scavenging. Come on, Darrell's an Intellect 5 survivor. You knew this was coming. We have all the classics for the Scavenging archetype available to us. We have, of course, Scavenging. We have Professor William Webb, the finder of hidden connections from the Edge of the Earth expansion that you can use to get items back or get clues from other, and as well as getting clues from other locations. And there's a new Scarlet Keys card as well, Salvage, which lets you choose an item asset in your discard pile to either get money by removing that card from the game, or play the asset paying its cost. I don't necessarily know if Darrell is the preeminent salvage user, but if you have important items that you want to fish out of your discard pile, salvage is a good way to do it. More importantly, we have a lot of the important payouts. Schaffner's Catalog is a good way to get lots of money paying for item assets. Ice Pick 3 is probably the most important card in the Scavenging deck. It lets you get an extra deduction or extra vicious blow whenever you can recur it. And while Darrell cannot take the level 4 Eon chart, the level 1 Eon chart still gives him additional actions for moving, evading, or investigating. That is very good. He also can take almost all of the important setup cards for this archetype, which are cards like Short Supply, which is a permanent limit 1 per deck that you can only purchase at deck creation. Forced, when the first turn of the game begins, you discard the top 10 cards of your deck. This ensures that you have a very big discard pile to start the game with, and if you have recursion cards in hand, you can also fish key cornerstone cards out of the discard pile starting right away, which is kind of like drawing or searching your deck in a way. Alternatively, you could take Forced Learning. This is also permanent, limit 1 per deck, and purchase deck creation. It increases your deck size by 15, and then during each upkeep phase, instead of drawing 1 card, you draw 2 cards, discard 1 of them. This might not seem obviously synergistic with Scavenging, but you can discard the cards that you want to scavenge back and keep all the cards that you cannot scavenge. Doesn't always work out that way because drawing is random, but it is a fine way to get your deck humming and hawing and get more value out of your draw phase. I do want to warn you, you can take both of these, but it might lead to a bit of an inconsistent deck. At least in my experience, short supply decks really want to guarantee that they can get the key cards they need back, because otherwise they just dump 10 cards in their discard pile and that doesn't really do anything. And Forced Learning increases your deck size, which makes it a bit more inconsistent. But you can combine those. I think one card to shout out here as well is Winging It. You can play Winging It for your discard pile, and when you do, it basically acts as another deduction. It gives you an extra clue. This is a fantastic card to include with Forced Learning, because every time you see the Winging It, you just toss it in the discard pile, and then when you use it from the discard pile, it gets shuffled back into your deck, so you're going to see it again. Toss it in the bin again. And you don't have to ever play it from your hand, where it would have a much smaller effect. Scavenging is an archetype that I've talked about a lot, so I'm kind of going through it fast, because I assume most of you, if you've seen my videos, will know how good Scavenging is. If not, well, I'm probably going to do a Scavenging Darrell video at some point, so tune in for that. I think it's a fantastic archetype, and yeah, I'm looking forward to trying it. Now moving on, we have another archetype that I think is kind of brand new to the Scarlet Keys expansion, and that is dropping clues. Now it's not entirely true that we haven't seen any other cards that let you drop clues before. Quick Study is kind of iconic in the sense where you can drop one of your clues in your location and exhaust it to get +3 skill value for skill test. A Dunwich classic is Dr. William T. Mallison. He's working on something big. If you draw an encounter card, you could exhaust a Dr. William Mallison, place one of your clues on your location to cancel drawing an encounter card, shuffle it back into the deck, and then draw a new card. So if you draw a card you don't want to see, just get rid of it. And Forewarned just let you cancel a treachery by placing one of your clues on location. Scarlet Keys comes with a bunch more cards for this archetype. Captivating Discovery lets you search the top 6 cards of your deck, and then you may place up to 3 clues on your location. For every clue you drop, you can add 2 of the search cards to your hand, and then shuffle your deck. Great for finding those key pieces that you need to get your deck set up and going. The Dr. William T. Mallison gets an upgrade. He's now working on something bigger, which I love that they changed the subtitle. When any investigator draws an encounter card from the encounter deck, you can exhaust him, place one of your clues on location. That investigator draws another card from the top of the encounter deck, chooses one of those 2 cards to resolve, cancels and discards the other. So important changes. It now affects anyone, regardless of location. And you get to look at the other card before choosing which one you actually want to resolve. You get to discard the one you didn't choose. That means that if you draw something like an Ancient Evils and you don't want to deal with it, it's gone. And finally, the new skill card analysis. 0 XP, has a single wall icon, it's practice traded. After revealing a Chaos token for the skill test, you may place one of your clues on your location to cancel that Chaos token, return it to the Chaos bag, and reveal a new one. And you may do this any number of times. I'm not quite sure how good this is yet. It seems like it's more of a combo card than just pure value, because you really need to be getting value out of dropping your clues, because as we'll talk about in a second, there's a lot of tempo loss when you drop your clues. But it's worth saying that this can cancel the autofill, which that alone makes me interested in using this card for some like bless or curse strategies maybe, right? Try to fish for those curse tokens and then make sure that you don't autofill the test. Pretty cool. But the real reason that this archetype I think is getting some traction in the Scarlet Keys isn't because we're getting more cards that let you drop clues, but because we're getting cards that reward you for dropping your clues. First of all, research notes. The 0 XP 1 cost asset, item, tome, science traded, hand slot. And after a player card ability places one or more of your clues on your location, you can place that much resources on research notes as evidence. So dropping clues now give you evidence. And you can use that with Darrell's ability, or alternatively, you can have an action test intellect 0, and for each point you succeed by, you may spend an evidence to discover 1 clue at your location. So this is a good way to recoup some of the tempo lost by dropping your clues. And as I said in the previous video where I talked about research notes, you don't have to pick up the clues at the same location you dropped them. Right? If you're standing at a low shard location and you have a captivating discovery, you can drop 3 of your clues there, draw 6 cards, pick those up real quick, and then move over to the big 4 or 5 shard location, test intellect 0, and if you succeed by 3, just clear that location out right away. Probably far more pressing, however, is the Press Pass. This 4-cost 2 XP Seeker asset is just within the limits of Darrell's deck building. It has a willpower and agility icon, it's item and charm traded, it takes up the accessory slot, and it has the very powerful ability, after you spend one or more clues or place one or more of your clues on your location, you can exhaust the Press Pass to take an additional action during your turn, or your next turn if it's not currently your turn. This card fights back against one of the biggest problems with dropping clues, which is that it slows you down, right? If you need those clues to advance, dropping those clues sets you back. You're going to have to spend actions investigating and getting those clues back. The Press Pass says, yeah, but you get an extra action. So you get that action, get those clues back. And if you're combining this with research notes, then you're getting evidence, which you can then spend to get those clues back if you need to. And keep in mind, you're not just dropping clues for clues' sake, you are getting some benefit. Even if it's just a +3 on a test you didn't think you were going to pass with the quick study, or maybe it's something like getting 6 cards with Captivating Discovery, getting an extra action, picking those 3 clues back up, and you're Darrell, right? You have additional clue compression. One card that I especially want to highlight here is the card Newspaper level 2. I don't see people talking about this card a lot, but I think it's actually quite good. You get +2 intellect while investigating if you have no clues. And as a reaction, when you would discover one or more clues at your location, if you have no clues, discover an additional clue at your location. So this combos very well with dropping your last clue, right? You make sure you have no clues, you drop all the clues you had, and then you can get one additional one back without having to pay anything. If you do this frequently, it's really going to pay off and really going to work as a compression engine. So yeah, I think dropping clues is a new archetype. I'm curious to see how powerful it will be. I think quick study is kind of important for having this ability every single turn, because a lot of the other effects are more situational, especially the skill and events. You're only going to use it once, and Melicen, I'm not sure if you want a Melicen every turn. So yeah, that's clue dropping. Next up, we have the Mythos Mitigation, or the encounter deck, as it were. See, the thing with Darrell's ability is that he needs to get clues at location with treacheries or enemies, but he's not actually very well tacked at dealing with those enemies or treacheries. He's got 3 agility, which is like mediocre, and he's only got 2 willpower and 2 combat. Fortunately for him, he's in the classes that have pretty good answers to a lot of these kind of treacheries and enemies. Grizzled is one of the survivor customizables, and it gains extra wild icons if you have named the right traits on your upgrade sheet, turning it from a single wild icon into a 5 wild icon or even more. This is a great card to have in your back pocket as Darrell. If you're worried about enemies, you can use it to evade them. And if you have certain treacheries that you really want to pass and you're worried your 2 willpower isn't going to cut it, make sure to name the right traits on your upgrade sheet, and then you can get through those no problem. Another new card from the Scarlet Keys is the Orphic Theory. A 2-cost 1 XP asset with intellect icon. It is a spell, uses the arcane slot, and has 4 secrets even. And you can spend the secret to choose any non-weakness treachery not attached to an elite enemy. To the end of the round, treat that card's printed text blocks as if it were blank except for traits. So we're saying, of course, that if you blank a treachery, its effects are all gone, but it doesn't lose any of the uses that were on it, specifically the evidence. So you can place the evidence on a card, use Orphic Theory to blank it, do whatever you need to do to get that evidence off there, and then hopefully discard that treachery or at least ignore it in some other way. And finally, I think Alter Fate is a card that is only proven to be incredibly powerful. And so I wanted to shout out, Darrell can take Alter Fate, and it's probably a very good card. It just free trigger window, 1 cost, discard any non-weakness treachery not attached to the lead enemy. It's like Orphic Theory, but it just gets rid of it. You want to make sure you can get the evidence first, but it's just important that if you have, especially if you're playing solo or lower player count, that you have answers to treacheries, because Darrell doesn't have the stats to go toe-to-toe with a lot of these things. If you're wanting to do a little bit more control over the encounter deck, you can do that. I already talked about Melicen. The Return to Circle Undone gave us the 9 of Rod Tarot, 3-cost, 3 XP asset that has the Tarot ability to start in play if you've drawn in your opening hand. And after you draw when you draw a non-weakness encounter card, you can exhaust it to cancel the card's effect, shuffle it in the encounter deck, and then draw another card from top of the encounter deck. And you can use this every single turn. And it seemed like a potentially fun card to include in Darrell if you're trying to get only enemies or treacheries that stick in play, so that you can actually use this Kodak every single turn. Because it's worth saying, a lot of treacheries that just have a revelation effect and then are discarded, those don't do anything with this Kodak, right? They have to be actually entering play or entering your threat area in some way, attaching to a location. If they just have a revelation test and then are discarded, they only are in limbo. That's that new rules text that we talked about in the FAQ video. And they won't ever enter play. You can't use your Kodak on those. Finally, Survivor also gets a test of will. If you need to deal with a treachery, that's a good way to do it. As for enemies, Darrell has probably a pretty tough time with enemies, but he's got some pretty powerful options if he needs to panic and deal with something anyway. I've got a plan, and I've got a plan level 2, our Seeker Classics that let him deal extra damage if he's got a bunch of clues. Not that great if you're playing the clue dropping strategy, but assuming you're hoarding your clues a little bit, you can easily have this deal 4 damage and take out an enemy. You're only going to get one shot at it, so make sure to line up that shot properly and maybe use your Kodak or your evidence to reduce the difficulty slightly. But that should protect you a little bit. I'm of the opinion that even if you are just the cluever and you have other peoples to deal with the enemy, you should always have at least some answers, because you never know what might pop up and somebody's like, well, I can't help you. I drew my weakness and I drew this other card and I just can't help you. You're like, okay, I've got a plan. Likewise, exploit weakness isn't always going to work, but if you have an enemy that maybe has a low evade value and a high fight value, or vice versa, this could be very nice to just get rid of them for paying 1 evidence and then using this 2-cost event to quickly get a tough enemy off the board. I know there's definitely a couple of enemies in the Dunwich Legacy where they have like 6 health but only 1 fight. Just exploit their weakness, get them out of there. And finally, Expedition Retreat is a card that I actually think is pretty underrated over the whole. If you're committing it during a basic evade action, it gains 2 additional agility icons, so it becomes a 3 agility icon. If you have track shoes, you're already looking at evading at a 7. And if the text happens to be successful by 2 or more, you can also evade another enemy at your location. So there's a lot of value packed into that 1 XP card, and if you're playing solo or 2-player, this card is very good. One of the things with Expedition Retreat is that it's not that good in situations where things are under control, but if you're getting swamped by enemies and you're in a panic, it's one of those cards that is one of the only effects in the game that's going to get you out of that. And those are the kind of cards that I value a lot, right? I don't need cards that help me when I'm already winning. I need cards that help me when I'm not winning, when I'm losing really hard. And Expedition Retreat is one of those cards. Definitely recommend picking this one up. Much more than Brute Force and Darrell, because he's only got 2 combat. And finally, something that I just wanted to quickly mention are remote clues. I've been talking a bit about how you can, blank treacheries or otherwise negate treacheries, and hopefully you have other teammates that can help with the enemy so you can get the clues without being punched by them. But getting clues at different locations can also help with getting clues so that you can get the evidence off of cards without having to stand there and get punched in the face. I don't really have a deck archetype here, but it might be worth to look at including 1 or 2 of these cards in your deck if you have the space for them. Something like Pocket Telescope is an easy slot that lets you look at the revealed side of unrevealed locations, as well as investigating a revealed location as if you were there. Professor William Webb functions very well in the Scavenging deck because in addition to getting item cards back from your discard pile, he also grabs clues at connecting locations. And Seeking Answers, I think, is one of those cards you could just slide into a deck and have a nice little benefit without really popping off. If you succeed, instead of discovering clues normally, you get to pick 2 clues from your location or connecting locations. This could even help you get evidence from multiple locations at once if you need to. So yeah, I think you don't necessarily have to build a remote clue Darrell deck, but it could be worth having 1 or 2 cards in there, just in case, you need to grab a clue over there and there's a big enemy on top of it. It's like, yeah, let's not go in there. Let's just grab 1 clue and leave it there. So yeah, those are the archetypes or things that I want to talk about with concerns to Darrell. I think each one of these aspects is something that you're going to, or that you could consider while building your deck, right? You could build a pure Scavenging deck, a pure difficulty 0 deck, a clue dropping deck, a deck that just wants to build as much evidence as possible. But I think Darrell decks are going to be better when you try to combine certain aspects. So for example, if you're doing a difficulty 0 deck, you're probably going to want to use Old Keyring so that you can set up things like Shadow Light. Well, when you do that, you're guaranteeing that you're going to be succeeding by 2, because an intellect test, you're at 5 intellect. You're testing against difficulty 0 if you auto-succeed. So you're going to get the Scavenging triggers. And you can then use those Scavenging triggers to get the Old Keyring back. So there's certainly a lot of synergy here, and there's a lot of cards that can work well together. It's kind of up to you to decide which aspect you want to combine and which aspects combine well, right? Here we see an example where these cards work really well together, but most of the cards in the clue dropping archetype, for example, don't go into the discard pile. So maybe Scavenging is a lot less useful if you're combining it with those clue dropping effects. And one thing to be very conscious of is Darrell has a lot of cards he wants for his hand slots, right? I've only been talking about the cards that I thought were most relevant. You know, Flashlight hasn't even made it onto the picture. And even then, I'm already talking about 5 or 6 different cards that enter his hand slots, and there are a lot more that could. When you're building Darrell deck, resist the urge to overstock his hand slots, and the other slots as well, right? Accessory slot, I think, is a little bit less pressure, but there's still quite a couple of cards, and if you're going for that clue dropping archetype, you're going to need that press pass. If you're going for allies, there's a bunch of good allies in Seeker and Survivor, so keep in mind, while you're building him, not to put too many cards to go into the same slots, because you're not going to be able to hold all of them. And look for cards that maybe allow you to cheat the slots a little bit. For example, Research Notes or Tome, you can use the Raven Quill to make it slotless. So yeah, that's it. That's Darrell. I don't think this is a comprehensive guide of every possible Darrell deck. In fact, it is more of a inspiration video, right? It's a deep dive into the different things that I think you could do with Darrell, but it's kind of up to you to put these pieces together and to make a beautiful deck. And I hope you can, because I think Darrell's a very powerful investigator. He's pretty likely to be the most powerful investigator in the Scarlet Keys. His combination of powerful deck building and cool ability make him a card that I think we will see a lot of, and I think a lot of people are going to be very happy to play him. So I hope this helps you. Thank you for watching. If you have any comments, please leave them below. Try to like the video if you got this far, because I put a lot of work into this one. As with before, deep dives are really me trying to put as much info in a comprehensive way as possible. And I hope I worked. So thank you for watching, and I'll be seeing you until the end of time.